Princess and the Pea and Ham Soup by Foodytales.com. I'm sure you've heard the story of the Princess and the Pea, haven't you? How the prince wanted to marry, but his parents, the king and the queen, wouldn't be satisfied with just anyone the prince fancied. Oh no, they had to be sure it was a true princess. So they hatched a plan to test all his suitors to find out which one was a real princess. Well, every potential princess who came to the castle would be invited to have dinner with the prince, and just as he was beginning to enjoy himself and relax a little in her company, each princess would be whisked off to bed, where she would be forced to sleep on a bed made up of 100 mattresses, one on top of the other, with a single pea at the bottom. Surprisingly, only one of the hundreds of potential princesses toppled off the tower of mattresses, ending up battered and bruised and embarrassed in the morning, only to be given her marching orders anyway, since surely no true princess would be so ungainly as to fall out of bed. And only the princess who complained of a bad night's sleep, apparently because she could feel a larger lump in her bed, the pea if you hadn't guessed, would be the true princess. Sounds like a bit of a whiny choice to me. Really, though, wouldn't a true princess be too gracious to complain about a mere lump in her mattress? What about showing your hosts some respect? So, for many weeks, an endless procession of potential princesses filed through the castle, and every day the mattresses had to be aired and restacked, and the bed at the very top of the stack had to be remade, and a fresh new pea had to be put underneath the enormous stack. This was all diligently done every day by the future princess's maid-to-be, whose name was Wendy. Now Wendy was one of those girls who was not remarkably beautiful upon first seeing her, but her beauty grew beyond that of any beauty queen's the more you knew her. Her hair, which was a plain brown, would take on a gloss and indescribable colour upon gazing at it for some time. Her eyes, which were a plain green, would take on the glow of precious emeralds upon gazing into them for a while. Her smile, which was in truth a little crooked and far from perfect, would light up the whole world and bring so much joy to those around her that it would defy anyone not to fall in love with her, if they spent enough time with her. And many had. Wendy was not short of a good many suitors herself, but the one person that mattered to her most was far too busy and preoccupied to give her a second glance. Of course, it was the prince himself. She had watched him from a distance for many years, first as a kitchen hand, where she had begun her duties at the castle with her mother at the tender age of 5, and working her way up the servant ladder over the next 13 years to one of the most prestigious jobs of all, the first maid to the future princess. For many years she had watched the prince grow up, first playing as a child, running around the castle, happy and carefree, attending his lessons and learning to ride, until he became a young man and no longer seemed as happy and carefree as she remembered him to be. Now he was anxious under the pressure of finding a suitable wife. He worried about choosing the right person to spend the rest of his life with, which he was expected to do over one meal. But even when he felt he would like to get to know a particular princess better, he was never able to, because she would have been swiftly bundled away and sent home by morning, in time to get the place ready for the next new guest. The prince didn't really care if his prospective bride was a princess or not. He just wanted to love her. He was just going along with his parents' plans to keep them happy, and because they had nagged him into it. Now he was finding the whole business a great big drag. He didn't know what to do or who to turn to, or how he was going to carry on with all these shenanigans. He was even beginning to lose his appetite, especially having to endure a bombardment of fancy meals in the company of all the fair maidens he had to dine. In fact, he was sure he was developing a painful ulcer from all the rich meals served with a dash of stress, when all he dreamt about was something plain and wholesome to eat in his own company. So the marathon went on, without any success, and the prince began getting noticeably thinner. The king and queen began getting worried, but the procession of princesses continued on, and all the time Wendy cleaned, changed, and washed the bedding, and removed the old pea and replaced it with a new one. Not being a wasteful sort of person, Wendy saved all the dried peas, and after several months she had quite a little stash. Now, apart from Wendy's terrific personality, she also had another wonderful trait. She was a fantastic cook. She could concoct the most gorgeous food from the most meagre of ingredients in the pantry, and tempt even the fussiest eaters to sample her gourmet nosh. and because she was concerned about the prince and had noticed his gaunt appearance too, she set about creating a recipe that would tempt the prince to regain his appetite. She had an idea that the prince was probably fed up with all the fancy rich meals he had to endure, so Wendy thought the best thing would be to devise something simple and wholesome. That reminded her of a lovely soup her mother used to make for her when they worked in the castle kitchen. She remembered that when she was feeling ill or upset, her mum would make her this soup and she would feel nourished and happy as soon as she ate it. Yes, that's what she'd make for the prince too. That's exactly what he needed, she thought. Luckily, the soup called for peas, and heavens knows she'd collected enough of these over the last few months. Now she just had to gather the other ingredients and find the time to sneak into the kitchen when the other cooks weren't busy preparing the royal meals so that she could whip up her mother's pea and ham soup. That wouldn't be the difficult part, she thought. The most difficult part would be getting it to the prince at all, and not only that, getting him to eat it too. He didn't look like he was all that bothered about eating anything at the moment. Well, she'd worry about that later. First she would get the soup made, and then hope some opportunity would arise. Late that afternoon, after the royal meal had been prepared, the prince had entertained another potential princess, the feast had been cleared away, and the princess whipped off to bed, Wendy stole into the kitchen and began to prepare her soup. She thought about the prince the entire time. She imagined him laughing again as she chopped the ingredients. She pictured him running carefree around the castle as she stood over the frying pan. She willed him to be happy as she stirred the soup, and she dreamt of walking with him hand in hand down the aisle as she added the final touches and seasoning. In her rapture with making the soup, she didn't notice the prince sneak into the kitchen and head straight to the larder to hunt for something plain and nourishing to eat. She didn't notice him catch a whiff of her soup and his eyes light up. She didn't notice him approaching her until he stood right behind her, taking in deep breaths of the soup's wonderful aroma. "Oh, what's that you're making?" he piped up, startling Wendy, who almost knocked the pan off the stove as she spun around. On seeing who it was, she lowered her head in a humble bow and replied, "Pea and ham soup, your highness. Would you like to try some?" "Pea and ham soup? I've never tried that before, but I dare say it's a better use for peas than what they've been used for in this palace in the last few months. I'd love to try some. It smells so delicious and I'm starving. Afraid I couldn't manage the pâté de foie gras and pigeon pie with sautéed truffles and pork gravy. Oh, I'm afraid all this rich food gives me terrible heartburn." Wendy dished out a large bowl of the soup and set it on the kitchen table, and with some fresh crusty bread she had found in the larder earlier. The prince sat down and drew a big spoonful of soup into his mouth. No sooner had it touched his taste buds than the prince looked up and saw Wendy as if for the first time. He noticed her glossy brown hair, her emerald eyes, and as he stared at her, she gave him the most stunning smile he had ever seen, which warmed him to the tips of his toes. Whilst he devoured the rest of the soup, Wendy and the prince chatted and giggled, and slowly the colour returned to the prince's cheeks, and sparkle returned to the prince's eyes, and a warm glow encircled the two of them. As he scoffed the second bowl of soup, the prince fell in love. Well, to cut a long story short, the prince decided to confront his parents and tell them he'd had enough of hunting for a true princess when he didn't feel any of them could really make him happy, and if they truly cared about their son, his happiness should be all that mattered. Upon seeing the prince back to his old self, the king and queen realized what they had been putting him through and agreed his happiness was more important than finding a so-called true princess. Anyway, they decided that the method they'd been using wasn't the most reliable one anyway, and who would care, as long as a future princess could win over their subjects? With that, the prince told them about Wendy, and on meeting her themselves, over pea and ham soup, they fell in love with her too, and a marriage was arranged immediately. On the morning of the wedding, Wendy woke up after the worst night's sleep she'd ever had, and felt battered and bruised all over. She put it down to a slight case of wedding day jitters, and excitedly headed off to get ready. A few moments later someone slipped into her room, reached under her mattress, and pulled out a pea. Having seen Wendy leave the room rubbing her aching back, the queen smiled to herself contentedly.